All right, hey guys, welcome back. We're doing a quick podcast for one of our topics this week. We're looking at our volitional verbs. We're into Ross chapter 20. Now, last day in class, we looked at the verb consecutive, and we saw that was based on the imperfect, so that was helpful. Today, we're going to look at another series of forms, these volitional forms, that are, again, very closely related to the imperfect. So here we're going to get something new, but we're going to build on the basis of something already familiar. And again, this reminds us of how important it is to know our basic Cal-strong paradigms. So if you haven't nailed that one down yet for the perfect, and especially the imperfect now, take some time to get that in your head, and what we're talking about here will become a little bit easier, I would hope. So let's move right into things. On the docket today is really three sets of verbs, although we'll see that maybe together they create one full paradigm, and they fall under this category of volitional verbs, that volitional mood. Now, these are verbs that are not in the indicative mood. We kind of touched on that topic, or that term rather, last week. The indicative mood is the mood of reality, whereas volitional verbs, like the Jussive, the Cohortative, the imperative, they're in the realm of wish, desire, command, injunction, entreaty, those types of things. I like to think of them again as not in the realm of reality, but expressing potential or possible action. So they're in the realm of possibility, kind of one rung above reality, if you will. We're going to look at three of these today. We'll look at the imperative, which is our second person. Shouldn't be the cohortative there. Our imperative is the second person. The Jussive is the third person, and our cohortative is first person. So those are need to be corrected. So again, that third person is our Jussive, second person imperative, and cohortative first person. So what this means is we're not really learning three full new paradigms, but variations on volitional verbs that apply in each of these three persons. So effectively together, then these would constitute a new paradigm. As you can see at the end of the textbook, they're kind of plugged in on page 544. But what I want to focus on here, rather than a full paradigm, is looking at patterns for recognition and how each of these forms grow out of the imperfect that we already know. So let's move along. All right, here's some basic background items for us to know as we move into what will be our most common form of volitional verbs, and that's the imperative. So these are our second-person volitional verbs, our imperatives. These most often will express direct commands or injunctions. They may also be used to connote someone granting permission or making a request. Now, one place where we see that latter sense, that making a request sense, very common, very frequently, is in petitions to God. So within prayers, for example. The reason being that in a prayer or a petition, you're beseeching God to act in a way that's favorable. You're not commanding God. So you'll see these imperatives used in that sense here. Now, again, to reiterate, these imperatives will always, always, always be second person. So there is not technically a full paradigm. They'll always be second person. So what that means is we need to only watch out for their gender. They'll be masculine or feminine, as well as their plural, or well as their number, rather. So our singular plural, you, or our singular number, rather, is you, whereas our plural forms will be that idea of you all, y'all, with a plural. Now, here's the best news of the day. All of these forms are based on the imperfect. So, in fact, if we look closely at them here in a minute, we'll see that they don't involve anything new at all. They're formed by removing a morpheme that we already know on our existing imperfect. And that's really what we're seeing here. We have our imperfect form there on the left, TIF code. That's our second masculine singular that we know from our paradigm. Now, on the front of that verb, we said the imperfect was a preformative conjugation. So if we remove the tav with the hitic under it, then effectively what we get is our imperative. So we get peko. That would be the first example of what this looks like. So when we are thinking of how to form the imperative based off of our imperfect, it's essentially removing all of those preformatives, those tav preformatives. And when we do that, we get a full paradigm like we see on the left. This is the same paradigm that you'll see on page 149 of the textbook. We have pecode, pikdi, pikdu, pekodna. That was pekod, pikdi, pikdu, pekodna. Now, beyond that basic subtraction of the preformative, we are seeing a few differences here, or potential differences. So let's just walk through a couple of those. There's really two minor things to note. One of them shouldn't surprise us by now, and one is honestly something that is kind of new. So we'll look at both. What we see in the 2FS and 2MP forms, so 2FS here, pikdi, 2MP, pikdu. What we're seeing is when we remove the preformative, when we remove this, that occasions a vocalization change under the first consonant. This is simply due to the rule of Shiva, because if we were to, if we remove that preformative when it's dropped, we would be left with, in those forms, we would be left with two Shivas side by side, which is not allowed, as we know. So the first will transition into a Hidik because of our rule of Shiva. So that's where that Hidik comes from in those two forms. The second thing to know is that, and I believe Ross brings this to our attention on page 150, somewhere in there. Yes, 150, is this form down at the bottom of the page here. In some forms of the 2MS, and this is somewhat common, so have an eye out for it, we do in fact get a comets hey ending on the 2MS form. And that should seem odd to us because that comets hey ending, we've been used to seeing it with feminine forms, either nouns or our 3FS cal perfect and imperfect verbs. So what do we want to recognize here? When this ending is added, we do get reduction, and the first vowel becomes a comets hatuf. So the form here, in fact, has a short O-class vowel under the pay. That means we would pronounce this pokda, pokda. When we look back at our imperfect paradigm, we would have, if you want to flip to 544, and I'll do that with you here, and we look back to our Cal Perfect 544, there we are. Our Cal Perfect paradigm, we have pakad, pakeda. Now that looks almost the same were it not for our metheg. What you're seeing under that first pay is a metheg, and that metheg is what you'll need to notice to recognize that that is a perfect verb. Otherwise, it's the same as this kind of alternate form for the 2MS of the imperative. So watch out for that. The paradigms, if you memorize them and how to say them out loud, then that would also be helpful. Our perfect 3FSG was pakeda with a comets, whereas here this other form is pokda with a comets hatuf. So that's one thing to be aware of as you work through these forms and work through these paradigms. All right, that's how you'd form the imperative, and a few things to watch out for. Now, in terms of how to translate it, we're going to see that there's a few ranges of meaning that we might want to try on for size. Here's an example. Ivdu et Adonai. Avad means to serve. Et Adonai, there's our definite direct object, the Lord. Now, we could translate this a few ways. You could, if you felt it was important to make the subject of the imperative explicit, you could say, you serve the Lord, as if you're kind of pointing your finger at somebody. That's one option. In English, we quite often will leave the subject of imperatives implicit. So like item number 2 here, you can simply say, serve the Lord. That's probably something we would see the most common. The third option is something that might just be helpful in working translations. You probably don't want to have this in your final translation, but as you're working through a text and you translate, it might be a helpful reminder. You could plug in something like this, serve the Lord, with a exclamation point in parentheses. Again, that's good for kind of rough drafts and working translations, but it'll help you kind of keep that idea before you as you iron out the details. So that's the imperative, that's the forms, that's how to translate it. Let's move on down our conjugation to the cohortative. Okay, like the imperative, these express a wish, request, or command. So we're still in that world. Only now we're dealing strictly with the first person forms. Now, the great thing here again is that since the first person imperfect, singular, and plural are common gender, there are really only two forms to worry about here, a singular and a plural. And now these are formed in two ways. So good news, bad news. The first way is they're the same form as the imperfect. That can be super confusing, but at least we could say we don't have to memorize a new form. Now here is where context will have to be our guide. Generally, you'll be able to try to sort out if it's an imperfect verb or if it's a cohortative verb. If that's not helpful, one other kind of syntactical, not rule, but guideline we could use as a rule of thumb is in some sort of discourse or narratives, quite often we can expect cohortative to show up in the first position in a clause. That is, they'll be first, and any other regular imperfect verbs, for example, would follow thereafter. That's simply because it's syntactical, but also a genre type of thing. If you have entreaties and discourse, they're quite often fronted. So that's something to be aware of. Cohortatives often, not always, but often will appear first. So that's item number one. When we have an imperfect, that's the same as a cohortative. That's how you might try to tell them apart. Now, item number two is a little more helpful because there's something of an indicator for us in the form. It's quite common for the cohortative to be formed by the addition of a comma-te ending to the first person imperfect forms you already know. So nifcode, we will appoint on the left, that's our imperfect. We know that from our paradigm, so that's old news. Nifkida, you can see that we have the same form plus a comma-te is how we get our cohortative. Let us appoint, or may we appoint, something like that. So that's second item is going to be very helpful to remember because we do see a good number of those formations of the cohortative in the Hebrew Bible. So we go from nifkod to nifkeda, simply adding a comma-te, and again, this only applies in the first person singular and plural. So let's have a look at just one of these. I believe this example is coming from Psalm 119:44. Eshmera Toratecha. Eshmera Toratecha. So what does that mean? Okay, our second word there is your laws or your instruction, your Torah, right? The first verb is a cohortative. We see our comma-te on the end. We see our aleph prefix, so we know that's a first person cohortative. Shamar, simply meaning to keep or guard or watch. So the translations we have here would be something like, may I keep your law, or let me keep your law. There again, we're in that world of potential or possibility. It's not I will keep your law. That would be an imperfect. Here it's a cohortative, may I keep your law. So that's our cohortative first person forms and meanings. Okay, the final set to look at. We're into the third person here. Now we're into our jussives. Imperatives are second person, cohortatives are first person, jussives are third person. Here again, we have the least to go on. In these instances, the jussive, in fact, is the exact same as the imperfect. There is no ending, there's no beginning, there's no removing something, so it's differentiated. Jussives are not terribly common, they're common enough, but when you see them, they'll look exactly like the imperfect. So what do we have to go on? Well, magic wands, right? We have to call up our context. Here is where, again, we're going to want to pay attention to how a narrative or a discourse is developing to get a sense of if we're translating as an imperfect, something will happen or is ongoing, or is desired to happen in the same way that we would have here for a jussive. Again, not terribly consistent, but the same rule we saw for the cohortatives could also work here. Look for those jussives, volitional verbs, to show up in the first position. And then moving forward from there, typically you'll have more finite verbs. That's one of the things that can be helpful for us, but context will be our biggest key. All right, let's say a word on negations before we call it a day on this chapter. We touched on different uses of negative particles last week when we were looking at the imperfect. And here again, we're going to see that there's one other form of negation that we could learn. The first thing to recognize is imperatives are not coordinated with a negative particle. The second person negations, so if you want to negate negate something in the second person, you or you all, that will happen simply with the imperfect. So that's something to watch out for. You'll never have negation with an imperative. For the jussives and cohortatives, these can in fact be negated to signal usually a slightly milder prohibition than the types above, those permanent or immediate prohibitions. And what we find is that most often jussives and cohortatives will be partnered with the negative particle of to communicate those negative prohibitions. So that more or less does it for that chapter in Ross for this week. Have a read through there a lot more closely on your own. Definitely try your hand at the exercises on page 155. There we'll see some good review for a lot of the grammar we've touched on already, as well as a number of items that will be helpful for now weighing things in the balance between imperfect verbs and our volitional verbs.